The clink of ice in a whiskey glass was the only sound that dared to exist in the corner booth. Everything else, the murmur of conversations, the soft scrape of cutlery on porcelain, the distant jazz from the house band, seemed to bend around the silence emanating from that one table. Jade felt the shift in the room's atmosphere the moment he walked in. It was like a drop in pressure before a storm. The man, Kwon Jin-woo, moved with an economy of motion that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. His suit was a dark charcoal Tom Ford, tailored so precisely it looked like a second skin, a layer of expensive armor. He didn't look at the other patrons, yet the entire restaurant was aware of him, shrinking in on itself to give him space. With him was a little girl, no older than 7, swallowed by a dress the color of a fresh wound. She was a splash of vibrant red against the muted, wealthy tones of the dining room. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her dark eyes scanning the room with a disconcerting stillness that mirrored the man's. Jade watched as her coworker, a seasoned waitress who could charm $100 tip out of a stone, approached the table and faltered. The man didn't speak, merely gestured to the menu. The waitress took the order with a strained smile and retreated, her shoulders tight with relief. Jade's station was on the other side of the room, but she couldn't stop her gaze from drifting back. She saw the way the other staff gave the table a wide berth, the way the manager hovered nervously by the kitchen doors. Everyone saw a predator and his cub, something wild and dangerous brought into a civilized space. Jade saw a man and his daughter, locked in a bubble of profound silence. Her focus was pulled away by a demanding foretop, a flurry of wine orders and questions about the specials. She moved through her duties with the practiced grace of someone who had been doing this for years, her smile genuine but professional, her movements efficient.
She was good at her job.
It was a predictable world of transactions and pleasantries, a world that made sense. Then, a small silver fork slipped from the little girl's hand, clattering softly onto the polished marble floor. The sound was insignificant, yet in the charged silence of that table, it felt like a gunshot. The girl didn't move. The man didn't move. A busboy started forward, then stopped, catching the manager's sharp, subtle shake of the head. No one was to approach that table unbidden. Jade watched for a beat. She saw the girl's shoulders slump in a flicker of frustration, so small it was almost invisible. It was the posture of a child used to being unheard. On an impulse that defied all logic and the palpable fear in the room, Jade walked over. She bent down, her light pink dress brushing the cool floor, and picked up the fork. She wiped it with a clean napkin from her apron pocket before offering it to the girl. The child looked up at her, her eyes wide and guarded. Jade smiled, a real, gentle smile this time. Then she did something no one else in that restaurant could have done. She lifted her hands. "Are you okay?"
She signed.
The question was simple, formed with the muscle memory she developed over years of speaking with her grandmother. The girl's composure shattered. Her dark eyes, so still and old a moment before, flooded with disbelief, then with a desperate, hungry light. Her small hands flew up, a torrent of signs tumbling from her fingers, fast and articulate. It fell. "I didn't mean to. Father doesn't like when things make noise." Jade's heart gave a painful squeeze. She signed back slowly, calmly. "It's okay. It was just a little noise. My name is Jade. What's yours?" "Minjun," the girl signed, though her fingers shaped the name Min. "No one else knows."
The hands.
Before Jade could respond, a shadow fell over them. Kwon Jin-woo was looking down at her, not at his daughter. His eyes were not cold, as she'd expected. They were something far more dangerous, utterly focused. They were the color of dark, bitter coffee, and they saw everything. He hadn't moved from his seat, but his presence was an absolute weight. His gaze dropped to her hands, then back to her face. He said nothing. The silence was an interrogation. That was the moment everything changed. She had breached the wall he had built around his world. She had spoken a language only 2 people in his life were meant to understand. And he was not a man who tolerated trespassers. The end of her shift felt like a countdown to an execution. She cashed out, the familiar ritual of counting tips and folding bills doing nothing to soothe the frantic pulse in her throat. She could still feel his eyes on her, a physical pressure against her skin, even though he and his daughter had left an hour ago. She told herself she was being paranoid.
He was a rich, important man.
She was just a waitress. Their world had touched for a moment, and now they would spin apart again. But when she stepped out of the employee exit into the cool Los Angeles night, she knew she was wrong. A black sedan, so sleek and polished it seemed to absorb the light around it, was parked at the curb. Two men in dark suits stood beside it. They were built like brick walls, their faces impassive. They didn't look like drivers. "Jade," the taller one said. It was not a question. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "Mr. Kwan requires your presence." It was not a request. It was a summons. The choice to refuse was an illusion, and she knew it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. This was how her ordinary life ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet, polite command she had no power to defy. One of the men opened the rear door, a silent, irrefutable invitation into the dark. The penthouse was a cage of glass and steel suspended over the glittering sprawl of the city. It was beautiful and sterile, a museum of wealth with not a single personal touch, save for a small, worn teddy bear on a cashmere sofa. Kwon Jin-woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, a silhouette against the endless lights. He didn't turn when she entered. "You will be a companion for my daughter," he stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the silent room. "You will live here. You will teach her. You will speak to her when I cannot." He finally turned, his eyes pinning her in place. "Your salary will be 5 times what you make at that restaurant. Your family will be provided for. You will begin tomorrow." The words were stones, each one landing with absolute finality. He spoke of her life as if it were a line item in a budget he was rearranging. I can't just leave my life," Jade managed, her voice feeling thin and useless in the vast space. "You can," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You already have." He took a step closer. He smelled of cedar and something sharp, like smoke after a fire has been extinguished. "Min has not communicated with anyone but me since her mother died." A year of silence. "Until you." That was the hook. Not the money, not the threat that hummed beneath his every word, but the image of that little girl in the red dress, her hands desperate to be understood. His wound was his daughter. Jade saw it in the flicker of something raw in his eyes when he said the word mother. She filed that information away. Survival, her instinct screamed, was about finding the cracks in the armor. The days that followed blurred into a strange, gilded captivity. Jade's world shrank to the size of the penthouse, a private park, and the back seat of an armored car. She spent her hours with Min, their conversations a silent, fluid dance of hands and expressions. She learned that Min loved graphic novels and hated broccoli, that she was fiercely intelligent, and that her silence was not a void but a fortress built of grief. Jin-woo was a ghost in their lives. He would appear and disappear without a word, a presence felt more than seen. But Jade was always aware of him. She'd feel his eyes on her from a doorway as she and Min built a pillow fort in the living room. She'd catch him watching them from the security monitors in his office. He never smiled, but sometimes a tension in his jaw would release, a subtle softening so fleeting she thought she might have imagined it. The first real danger came on a Tuesday. Jade had taken Min to a heavily secured private garden, one of the few places Jin-woo allowed them to go. As Min chased a butterfly near a koi pond, Jade noticed them. 2 men on a bench across the lawn. They weren't looking at the flowers. They were looking at Min. They didn't have the coiled stillness of Jin-woo's men. They had a hungry, predatory lean to them. A cold dread washed over her. She casually called to Min, her hands signing for the girl to come to her. Her heart pounded, but she kept her movements calm, her expression placid. She guided Min toward the exit, feeling the men's eyes on her back. A car, a nondescript sedan, pulled away from the curb just as their own armored vehicle arrived. It followed them for 3 blocks before it was cut off by another of Jinwoo's cars in a swift, brutal maneuver that was over in seconds. That night, the penthouse felt less like a home and more like a bunker. Jade couldn't sleep. She found herself in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to pour a glass of water. A security door leading to a service stairwell had been left unlocked, an oversight, a test, she didn't know which. It was a way out. She could walk through that door and disappear.
Run.
Go back to her life of tips and tired feet. She walked to Min's bedroom. The door was ajar. In the soft glow of a nightlight, she could see the little girl curled around the worn teddy bear, her face peaceful in sleep. She saw the loneliness that clung to the child like a second skin. Running would mean leaving Min back in that suffocating silence. It would mean abandoning a child who was just learning to speak again. She made a deliberate choice. She walked back to the service door and locked it. She was staying. Not for the money, not out of fear, but for the little girl. When she returned to the kitchen, Jinwoo was there, leaning against the counter as if he had materialized from the shadows. He didn't ask where she'd been. He didn't acknowledge the locked door. He simply pushed a steaming mug of chamomile tea across the marble island toward her. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth in the cold, sterile room. It was the first act of unexpected tenderness, small and almost deniable, but it was there. He stayed while she drank the tea, the silence between them different this time. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything they weren't saying. Her choice to stay hung in the air, an acknowledged fact. She had looked into the abyss of his world and hadn't run. A few days later, she was on the floor with Min, teaching her the sign for constellation. Jinwoo appeared in the doorway. He often observed them, but this time was different. He didn't stay in the shadows. He walked into the room, his expensive shoes silent on the thick rug. He knelt on the floor, an awkward, unpracticed movement for a man so defined by his rigid control. Min's face lit up. She signed to him, showing him what she had learned. He watched his daughter's hands, then his gaze lifted, meeting Jade's over Min's head. In that moment, the charged space between them became a closed circuit. She saw a flicker of gratitude, of something that looked dangerously like trust. He saw a woman who had willingly chained herself to his sinking ship, who had chosen his daughter over her own freedom. She told herself it was survival instinct, a way to secure her place in this dangerous new world. She was lying to herself. The fragile peace was shattered by a delivery. A simple, elegant box left with the concierge. Jinwoo's head of security brought it to the penthouse, his face grim. Jinwoo opened it himself. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a dead sparrow and a single, perfect pink camellia. The exact shade of the dress Jade had been wearing the first night they met. It was a message from the Choi family, his rivals. A declaration. They had noticed her. They knew she was important. They had marked her as a vulnerability. The real attack came a week later. It was brutally efficient and terrifyingly public. Jade had convinced Jinwoo to let her take Min to a small, private bookstore. They were in the children's section when the chaos erupted. 2 men, their faces blank, moved toward them. It happened so fast. There was no time to think. Jade reacted on pure instinct. She grabbed Min, shoving the child behind her and into a narrow stockroom, slamming the door shut. She braced her body against it, her shoulder screaming in protest as one of the men slammed his weight against the other side. She could hear shouting, the crash of shelves, the panicked screams of other patrons. She held the door, her muscles trembling, and screamed for security. Jinwoo's men were there in an instant, a whirlwind of controlled violence. The fight was short and lethal. Jinwoo arrived moments later. He stormed through the wrecked bookstore, his face a mask of such cold fury it was terrifying. His eyes found her first, huddled in the stockroom doorway, her arms wrapped around a crying Min. He saw her, trembling but unbroken, standing as the last line of defense for his daughter. Something in his perfect, icy control cracked. He knelt, pulling Min into his arms, but his eyes never left Jade's face. They took one of the men alive. Jade overheard the interrogation from the other room. The sounds were guttural, punctuated by long, terrifying silences. Later, Jinwoo's chief of security emerged, his knuckles bloody. The captured man was gone. The problem had been solved. That night, Jinwoo found her on the balcony. He was wearing a black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. A deep, clean cut marred the back of his hand. He didn't say a word about the man from the bookstore. He didn't have to. "Did you hear anything earlier, Jade?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost casual. This was a test, a threshold. She could tell the truth, preserve the part of her that still belonged to the ordinary world. Or she could cross the line. She could choose his world. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't hear a thing," she lied. The lie settled between them, a foundation stone for a new, darker reality. She had made herself an accomplice. She had chosen. He watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He held out his injured hand. Without a word, she went inside and returned with the first aid kit. She cleaned the cut with an antiseptic wipe, her touch gentle but firm. Her fingers were steady. She wrapped the wound in clean white gauze, her movements precise. He didn't flinch, just watched her, his expression unreadable. "No one," he said, his voice a low rasp, cutting through the night air. "No one has looked at my daughter the way you do. Like she is whole." It was not a declaration of love. It was something more dangerous. A confession of need. An admission that she had become essential. He was acknowledging a debt, and in his world, debts were everything. The Choi family, however, were not so easily discouraged. They were losing their war against Kwon Jinwoo, and they grew desperate. If they couldn't get to his daughter, they would find another weakness. They found Jade's grandmother. The call came late at night. A grainy photo sent to Jinwoo's phone. Jade's grandmother, asleep in her favorite armchair, a man's hand resting on her shoulder, a distinctive Choi family ring on his finger. The message was simple. The woman for the girl's companion. A trade. Jinwoo's rage was a palpable force, a cold, killing thing that filled the penthouse. He began issuing orders, mobilizing his soldiers, preparing to burn the Choi family's territory to the ground. "No," Jade said, her voice cutting through his quiet commands. He turned to her, his eyes blazing. "This is not your concern. She is my grandmother," Jade said, her voice shaking but firm. "And your way will get her killed. You'll go in with guns and they'll use her as a shield. You know I'm right." He stared at her, his jaw tight. "I know that neighborhood," she pressed, her mind racing, a desperate plan taking shape. "I know the back alleys, the fire escape on the building next door, the old service tunnels under the laundromat. They'll be watching the street. They won't be watching the walls." She was no longer just a waitress. She was a strategist, born of necessity. She was fighting for her family, and that made her as dangerous as he was. He listened. For the first time, he let someone else lead. The plan was surgical, relying on stealth and timing, not brute force. Jade guided two of his best men through the labyrinthine alleys of her old neighborhood, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Jinwoo and the rest of his team were the diversion, a noisy, visible presence at the front of the building. They slipped in through a basement window, moving like ghosts through the familiar building. They found her grandmother in the living room, tied to a chair, two guards watching her. But the choice had made a mistake. They had brought Min with them, a final piece of leverage. The little girl was in the corner, her face pale with terror. The plan went sideways. One of the guards spotted them. A silenced gunshot, a muffled cry. The second guard grabbed Min, holding a knife to her throat. Everything slowed down. Jinwoo and his men were still downstairs. They were alone. But Jade had prepared for this. The night before, she had taught Min a new sign, a secret one just for them. It meant earthquake. Jade caught Min's eye.
She made the sign. Now.
Min understood. The little girl threw herself to the floor, boneless and screaming, a silent, convulsive fit of terror that was utterly convincing. The guard, startled, loosened his grip for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Jade needed. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a cast-iron skillet left on the stove, and brought it down on the man's head with all her strength. He crumpled to the floor. In the same instant, Jinwoo's men dealt with the other guard. The door burst open and Jinwoo was there, his gun raised, his face a mask of lethal intent. He took in the scene, the unconscious guard at Jade's feet, Min sobbing on the floor, his men securing the room. His eyes found Jade. He saw what she had done. She hadn't been rescued. She had been the rescuer. In the quiet aftermath, after her grandmother was safe and his men were sweeping the building, he cornered her in the narrow hallway. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her shaking. He reached out, not to comfort, but to claim. His hand cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her bone. His touch was a brand. Mine, he said. The word was absolute, a vow and a verdict. You are mine, Jade. It was not a question. It was the closing of a door, the acceptance of a fate she had forged with her own hands. One of his most trusted men had taken a bullet meant for her grandmother. The cost of their victory was paid in blood and loyalty, a debt that bound her to him even tighter. Weeks later, a new kind of quiet settled over the penthouse. It wasn't the sterile silence of before, but the comfortable quiet of a shared existence. Jade was no longer the help. She was the queen in a gilded cage she had helped reinforce. She stood on the balcony. The city lights a river of diamonds below. Min stood beside her, her small hand in Jade's. She was teaching Jade a new sign, her fingers shaping the characters for family. The sign was complex, involving the heart and the idea of a house. A presence settled behind them. Jinwoo. He didn't speak, didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of him, a constant, grounding force at her back. The night air was cool, and he draped his heavy cashmere coat over her shoulders. The fabric was soft, smelling of him, cedar, smoke, and power. She leaned back, a small, almost imperceptible movement, letting her weight rest against his chest. It was an answer, an acceptance. He was a monster, and his world was built on violence and fear. But he had looked at a little girl locked in silence and had torn the world apart to find her a voice. And that voice had been hers. She knew what this life was. She knew what she was choosing, and she was not running anymore.